Of the CSMVS and the Director General, Mr. Mukherjee, and all our colleagues. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Peter Heehs. And I have to say that the subject that he's chosen to address today, spirituality with God or without, is one that resonates for many, many of us, both in our experiential kind of approach, in how we lead our lives, and also in relation to the kinds of contemporary urgencies that we're all facing today, in the manner in which religion, religiosity, investment in a certain belief system, or an opposition to it, how all of these play out in the public sphere. So his work really attains a very particular kind of urgency in that context. So I will introduce Peter first, formally. Many of you here will know his work, that he's an American historian who has lived for a very long time, really nearly 5 decades in Pondicherry, and has a very special interest in religion and the religious imagination, but also with what I often think of as the genealogies of the modern, the manner in which religious ideas interact and are in interplay with conceptions of modernity, the discourses and the practices of modernity. Because it's often conventional to counterpose modernity to some notion of tradition. And that leaves some of us, some of the time, inattentive to the ways in which tradition itself gets refracted through the prism of modernity, and how these two seemingly antagonistic phenomena might actually inform and interpenetrate each other. Peter Heehs has, for all this period, really since the early 70s, been closely connected with the Sri Aurobindo Ashram archives. He joined the institution pretty much when it was established, and his engagement with it is really lifelong. And he's had to balance in dealing with that material between a criticality of engagement, the kind of attention that a historian would bring to his material, on the one hand, and on the other, what I would perhaps have to call a certain sort of devotionalism that attends and surrounds figures like Sri Aurobindo, as it might be, or many other religious and spiritual figures of that kind. So in his practice as a historian, he's actually negotiated these difficulties, and I'm sure he'll dwell on that as we go on. But how do you manage to have this kind of criticality of engagement and yet preserve a certain sense of what it is that makes for the specificity of a mystical quest, as it were? And how then do you respond to different kinds of publics? Of the public that reads history, that is conversant with the modes of history, and another kind of public which builds itself on notions of sometimes uncritical, unquestioning belief. Peter Heehs' work has also strongly emphasized the very complex period between the 1880s and the 1920s, roughly. A period that was very fertile and even febrile in terms of ideas about the nation, about a state of the future, about religious identity. Many of the themes that still preoccupy us came up during that period. And that was when, of course, figures like Vivekananda, Dayanand, Sister Nivedita, and others were very prominent and framed public discourse. That's actually one of his, that's the first book that I read by Peter. It was called The Bomb in Bengal. And it's a study of the young secret societies in Bengal during the Swadeshi period. And those of you I'm assuming everybody here has seen Satyajit Ray's film, Ghore Baire. That's the thrum of the time, the moment when the Swadeshi agitation moves into a violent phase. So what was that violent past of the freedom struggle, which we sometimes don't look at because there's only one aspect of it that we look at. And so it's not coincidental that Sri Aurobindo has been really at the center of Peter Heehs' work, because Aurobindo, as you know, made that transition from violent revolution to a spiritual quest. So of the 12 books that Professor Heehs has written, these are some of the key ones. The essential writings of Sri Aurobindo, a marvelous biography called The Lives of Aurobindo, and the title cues you into the multiplicity of the figure and of the readings. Also an anthology situating Sri Aurobindo, a reader, and another anthology which encompasses the spectrum across time, space, and style, I would say, of Indian religious thought. It's called Indian Religions. And today we're going to really focus, I think, on his most recent book, Spirituality Without God. And I'm not going to anticipate further because this is what we're going to be discussing. Also go into conversation after Professor Heehs has spoken. But I just want to dwell very briefly on this distinction between religion and spirituality, which is at the core of this book. Why is it that some of us shy away from religion and claim the ground of spirituality? In what way is spirituality defined? What kinds of genealogies in philosophy does it draw upon? These are the kinds of inspiring questions that this book addresses. And I'm going to end my introduction on a, I hope, forgivably autobiographical note. Because I first discovered the work of Professor Heehs when I was, in a previous life, 23 years ago, when I was religion and spirituality editor for the Times of India. And that title was a vexed one, and we came to it after much thinking, and it was clear even then that there seemed to have been some kind of tension between these two. So how might one think of writing about questions of religious practice, belief, inquiry, critical engagement, lifestyle spirituality, questions of the New Age and counterculture? What sort of spectrum are we looking at here? And what kinds of analytical and conceptual tools do we need? I think those are the key questions that Professor Heehs deals marvelously with in this book. And I look forward very much indeed to this. But before we go further, I'm going to invite Mrs. Meenal Shirsagar to felicitate, as we like to say here, Professor Heehs. Peter, could I invite you to take the floor?
Thank you so much, Ranjit Hoskote. And thank you, Dr. Mukherjee, for the invitation, and Dr. Vaidehi Savnal, and also Renuka Muthuswamy for all the help they've given us. As Ranjit said, I'll be touching on the distinction between religion and spirituality. I'll be doing it as a historian. My field is the history, at present, is the history of ideas. So I'm not going to be making any dogmatic statements about this sort of religion or that sort of religion, or religion is better than spirituality or worse. But I'm going to basically, as I do in the book, make a survey of different approaches to these questions in different cultures and at different times. I'll actually be, because we have a limited time here, I'll be focusing mainly on the ancient world and then bringing it around to the modern world, perhaps with an introduction about the modern world. The book, as someone has pointed out, sort of stresses the idea of religion being, spirituality being free from theism. But that's not an absolute thing, so that's why in speaking to you here, I wanted to bring out the fact that spirituality can be with God as well as without. So approaching this in a historical way, we'll be looking at the way that the idea of spirituality developed, and it's a rather modern idea. It's not something that was there in the past. We speak of ancient spiritualities, but at least the term spirituality in English, in the sense of something different than religion, is hardly 150 years old or even less. So let's make sure I know how to work this. Right. Nowadays, this has become a catchword, spirituality, spiritual but not religious, and many of us are really quite comfortable saying this. in America now, I know that 20 or 30% of the younger people identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. But it's the kind of phrase that gets bandied about a lot, and sometimes people really lose the sense of what they mean by it, what clearly is religion, what clearly is spirituality, and is there a distinction between the two? What do people mean? Why was it necessary? At what point did it become necessary to say that there was something different from religion and yet had maybe the essence, the core, the spirit of religion still in it? So in the West, of course, the thunderburst caused by Darwin in the middle of the 19th century was a moment when people really had to people who had over the years been losing, societies had been losing their faith in religion since the time of the Enlightenment and even before. Suddenly, the last hope that they had, the idea that God designed the universe and whatever else there may be, however God might be defined, there surely was a God, because the universe made sense. It couldn't make sense. It couldn't work if there was no designer. And then Darwin effectively showed for many people that this design of the universe took place by means, especially in terms of biological species, took place as a result of natural selection. So that was sort of the end of this firm belief in God in Europe. And that made it possible. What were people going to then base their inner aspiration on if it wasn't the Christian religion or any other religion? And I think 7 or 8 years after Darwin's book appeared, we find the great English art critic Walter Pater saying, "But what is this spiritual element? It is the passion for inward perfection with its sorrows, its aspiration, its joys." Doesn't mention religion, doesn't mention God. And so here's a highly educated man, highly influential, and somehow separating the two. Actually, it was in India where one of the first articulations of religion being distinct, or spirituality being distinct from religion, was made, and it was made by Sri Aurobindo in 1910. As you can see, spirituality is a wider thing than formal religion. Spirituality is a single word expressive of 3 lines of human aspiration towards divine knowledge, divine love and joy, divine strength. So we had the notion of spirituality arising in people like Pater. We had Sri Aurobindo actually making a distinction. But what actually was at play here? What were people talking about? And how did spirituality, why was it needed as a concept? Well, again, we had the failure of religion on the one hand, but we still had people feeling they needed somehow to approach what Aurobindo calls divine knowledge, divine love and joy, divine strength. So how do you approach these things without God? In Aurobindo's case, it was through yoga, and he was not, although he didn't reject any religion, he was not really a theist. He's been turned into a theistic sort of figure now, but it's not really, if you read his works, the essential to his thought. So how did this idea of spirituality develop, and where it was maybe 15 years after Aurobindo, in 1924, I think, that first people began to think spirituality without religion, or religion spiritual but not religious. Now, by the time I came to New York in the mid-'60s, the hippie era, and that was sort of taken for granted, and I think now even more so, to speak of spirituality without religion, to speak of I'm spiritual but not religious, we just take it for granted. But it simply wasn't there before the middle or late 19th century. And again, there was certain social and intellectual currents that were making this come about. Now, this development has continued over the years. So now, say 50, 60 years beyond the 60s, we have a lot of people talking about spirituality as a known thing. Everyone understands that spirituality is something that's distinct from religion. But what exactly do people mean when they're talking about it? So I've read tons of books and papers dealing with this subject, and I came up with what seemed to be its three main characteristics. That it's subjectivity to begin with. It's an inner thing. It's not an outer thing. So spiritual people cultivate inner feelings and experiences that are comparatively indifferent to outward standards of thought and conduct. That's maybe the key to most definitions of spirituality that you find in the literature. Secondly, autonomy, that spiritual people insist on personal freedom and are wary of doctrines, scriptures, and institutions. And finally, spiritual people, if we can speak of a spiritual person, pursue their practice as individuals, even if they do belong to groups. So there we can see kind of something that probably speaks to many of us. Many of us kind of take it for granted that what the spiritual life consists primarily of an inner effort. It's something, as we see historically, that's not really very has a long history. We could, in my previous book, which is a study of the history of the self, the idea, the concept of the self, I showed that the sense of individuality, of course, it was always there. It arose in Europe in the Renaissance. People became more self-aware, more self-confident, more aware to, more able to feel free from dogmas and scriptures and so forth. But it really didn't take form fully before, another great burst of individuality came in the early 19th century with the Romantic movement. So you have poets like Wordsworth, Goethe, who were speaking very much in the first person about their feelings, about how they as individuals relate to the universe and relate to God if they had a sense of God, but only not so much looking around, basing themselves on existing texts, existing traditions, and so forth. These are the basis, but there's also, if you read the literature about spirituality, there's what I might call the secondary characteristics of modern spirituality as we understand it today. So one very important thing is universality, that many people believe that the experiences on which spirituality is based are the same in all cultures and periods. Therefore, they are open to inspiration from various traditions. Now, scholars now tend to question the idea that the experiences that, say, a Sufi would have, or a Catholic mystic would have, or a Hindu, a Vedantin would have, are the very same across cultures. That's probably pushing it a little too far. It was very common. That was called the perennial philosophy. And there was a book by Aldous Huxley that put that forward. And it was taken up by people like Joseph Campbell and so forth. And during the 60s, maybe 70s, it had a good run. But then people began to point out that, there's really actually a great deal of difference, and that maybe it's impossible to speak of any tradition that is not anchored in a specific society, in a specific world of discourse. But on the practical side, I think what is important to spiritual people is that they are open to different sorts of inspiration. I don't think now we have people who are Hindus and they're reading books on Zen. We have Sufis or people in that tradition who are reading Chinese poetry and all. And there's a sense that this is possible, that you don't really have to be fixated in one tradition or another. So that's something that's new, and it's something that gives a lot of breadth and opening to spirituality in the modern world. Another secondary but important characteristic is the empiricism of spirituality, the spiritual approach. So you'll often find now spiritual teachers talking about spirituality as a science, that's something to be practiced, it's something that you can get your own results, and this is what makes yoga and things like Zen so popular among people of a certain sort, because they can actually not only do it themselves, but have a sense that it's if you do it, you'll get certain results. This again could be questioned perhaps, but it's mainly a change in orientation that's really remarkable. When you have someone who's fixed in a given religious tradition, given sort of a fixed set of rules and approaches, you can't really go beyond that. So that's what I call the second thing. Corporality is the third. The body has always, in many early religions, been considered. I'm sorry, I didn't switch. Been considered this body-mind dualism was always very important, and it was a limiting factor, and not just for hedonistic reasons. People who consider themselves spiritual think, well, it's really impossible to get away from the body, that we have to include the body in our spiritual aspiration and our spiritual efforts. So that's why many people are now involved in practices that have to do with physical work. You have yoga, you have Tai Chi, and that sort of thing. Now, I've been speaking from the side of spirituality, and you can see that I'm sort of on the side of the spiritual sorts of people. And that's not to say that there's not great advantages to traditional religion. And just to make these clear, I've got isolated a few points here, that if you are following a traditional religion, and you have an objective system of belief and a system of ethics, it just makes your life easier. You know what's right, you know what's wrong, you know what to do, you know what not to do. And I can really understand that people for centuries have held on to that as being the key to a well-lived religious life. And you can't knock it, you can't say that there's no value in that. Similarly, when I spoke of autonomy as being characteristic of spirituality, well, the opposite of autonomy is surrendering one's freedom to ecclesiastical authorities or the guru or whomever. And this shifts the burden of responsibility. We live in a kind of psychological uncertainty all the time, most of the time in our lives. And if we're to say that, well, the guru knows all or the bishop knows all, then it really makes life easier. Instead of individuality, which is, I said, one of the main points in spirituality, we have taking the comfort in belonging to the group. This also removes the burden of individual accountability. So there are advantages to religion. There's three more. We spoke about universality, but exclusiveness really makes it easier to face life. You don't have to wonder about this and that. Again, it's written or it's said what is what you should concentrate on, and there it's clear. Your life is in the open. the idea of scripture, which is many people now have turned away from written scriptures, but I mean to have 10 Commandments or things of that sort, it honestly makes life. Perhaps there's a stress of needing to follow the dictates of religion, but also there's the kind of ease of not having to think about things. Thou shalt not this and thou shalt not that, so it's life easier. And also, I mean, particularly in the ascetic religions, to be free from the cravings of the body supposedly makes it easier to approach your soul. Okay, so I've been talking about spirituality without religion, but what about spirituality without God? Is it even possible? One objection that people would make is, well, if you don't have God, if you don't believe in God, then you're an atheist. Atheist is the opposite of belief in God, in theism. And atheism obviously is bad because we know it's bad. It leads to immorality and that sort of thing. Is that really the case? Atheism, if you take away the value judgments made around it, simply means non-theism, not believing in God. And actually nowadays people, to avoid these negative connotations, have begun to speak of non-theism rather than atheism. And there have been throughout the centuries and throughout many, many cultures, non-theistic religions and philosophies. So in my book, I do survey and devote whole chapters to various non-theistic religious and spiritual traditions. Jainism as a whole does not believe in God, certainly not a creative God. Many forms of Buddhism also. In the ancient world, you really couldn't get away from things like demigods and spirits. Otherwise, how could you explain why lightning happens or earthquake happens and that sort of thing? But certainly Jainism and Buddhism, there was no creator God that directs the universe. So the idea of religion without God is actually not new at all. It's at least 3,000 years old, let's say. You've all heard about the 6 schools of Orthodox Hindu philosophy, and 2 of them, Samkhya and Mimamsa, are not theistic. Samkhya is actually, in its main scriptures, it's openly atheistic. Mimamsa does without God, because for Mimamsa the basic thing is the text of the Veda, which pre-existed the universe, pre-existed God. So when Samkhya and Mimamsa philosophers debated with other schools like Nyaya and Vaisheshika and Vedanta and so forth, they took the position of there being no God, and they put forward proofs against God. This was especially true of Buddhism. So you as I'll show later, you find people like Shantarakshita and Shantideva actually arguing energetically against God, that they far from trying to prove, as the Christians would do, that there was a God. They use logic and argumentation to prove that there wasn't a God. I don't know if either of the two actually was that successful. God is not the sort of thing that you can either prove or disprove, in fact. But certainly it's not a fact that Indian religion back before the beginning of the Christian era was fixed in a theistic form. In East Asia, China, Japan, and so forth, the main traditions, especially in China, were Confucianism and Daoism. And I'll show later, I'll discuss these a little bit later. But neither of them had a God figure, and very well could do without it. Their concern was not there in deciding what was behind the universe or how one should act, how one should orient oneself towards what one considered the supreme thing in the universe. In the Greco-Roman world, around the same time, this is after the great era of philosophy, early analytic philosophy in Plato and Aristotle. After the conquest of most of the what was then the Eastern world by Alexander, there developed in this world stretching from what is now Pakistan all the way to Spain, the Hellenistic world, and within that very cosmopolitan world view and way of looking at things, three philosophies arose, practical philosophies, not analytic philosophies: Epicureanism, Stoicism, and Skepticism. And I'll be speaking about them as well. Turning first to India, we think now of India as being a very theistic place. We think of India as the land of the gods. There's so many crores of gods and so forth. But way back, as far as the Rig Veda, we find a skeptical element there. So this I'm quoting from the 10th book of the Rig Veda, a late book, but nevertheless, in the Samkhya itself, whence this creation has arisen, perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down on it in the highest heaven, only he knows, or perhaps he does not know. So on the one hand, you have the Vedas promoting sacrifice, worshiping various gods, and that develops through various stages of Indian religion. You have the Brahmanas, you have the Upanishads, you have the development of theism from around the 2nd century before Christ. But you had this other trend always through it. Both, you had the theistic trend that began to become more and more important, but the non-theistic trend was also there. So I write in the book, and this is something I think that many people in India are unaware of, that Indian philosophy reached a pinnacle of brilliance between the 6th and 9th centuries, with philosophers of the Vedic, Jain, Buddhist, and Charvaka systems perfecting their ideas and criticizing those of others. Among the Vedic schools, only Nyaya and Vedanta fully backed the idea of a creator god, or Ishvara. And the dominant sub-school of Vedanta, that's Advaita, of course, looked on Ishvara merely as a prop for devotional practices. That's something that Shankara himself said. Many of the greatest thinkers of the era, Kumarila, Kumarila was, of course, a Mimamsa expert. Jinasena was a Jain, Shantideva and Shantarakshita were Buddhist, and many others refuted the God idea. Their arguments constitute the largest corpus of anti-theistic reasoning in any philosophical culture before the European Enlightenment. So it's people like to say that India got there first and we invented that, but you could almost say that India was, in fact, there before many others. At this time in Europe, the idea of actually advocating a non-theistic worldview or a non-theistic religion was just impossible to think of. I recently had an interview published in a newspaper, and of course it appeared online, and when that happens, people get on and start giving their comments about everything. And so I was really kind of surprised that among the apparently Hindu and even Hindutva sorts of people, they didn't have much trouble with the idea that I was promoting spirituality without God. And one guy who was clearly his I forget what his handle was, but very much a right-wing Hindu handle, came on and said, "Oh yeah, we were there first at Charvaka. We invented Charvaka. We Buddhists and other Hindus were the inventors of atheism. So which kind of surprised me. In fact, I might add that the only people that were really kind of violently against the ideas that I was putting forward were Christians. And I had a guy sending me, barraging me with direct tweets saying that no, this is not there and it's not possible. And so somehow I got the idea from this that people in India are really much more relaxed about this sort of thing, or Indian religions are really much more generally laid back about this. So the idea, I was a little surprised when people in India began to hear about this book and to speak about it. And it was a book that was written in the first instance for publication in the UK and the US. I really wondered whether people would in India would go for it, whether I would offend people. I have a habit of offending people, as Ranjit has pointed out. So it came to be it came as a pleasant surprise that people in India really were rather laid back about the idea. So yeah, I don't have to go hide or hire a lawyer or whatever. So turning it then to East Asia, we have Confucius, who's before Plato. He was hard to pin down the age of things in India, but certainly around the age of the late Upanishads, perhaps, we had a man developing a system of what people, when they have courses on survey courses of religion, they'll say, well, Confucianism is a religion. But they realize that it lacks most of the characteristics of religion that we find certainly in Western doctrinal religions, the what they call Abrahamic religions. Anyway, it's a practical philosophy, Confucianism. And it was, again, an era when you couldn't not think about spirits and couldn't not think about gods or ghosts, as they often translate these things. So when someone came to Confucius and said, well, how should we approach the gods and the spirits? He answered, you're not even able to serve man. How can you serve the gods and spirits? What he said was that you should serve man. That it's impossible to think of the individual as being separate from society, and that when each individual fits in, rightly performs his social role, that's a properly directed society. But there's no question of God. There's no question of beliefs. There's no question of dogmas. Similarly, in Daoism eventually became a highly theistic religion with all sorts of gods and all sorts of practices of what we call pujas and that sort of thing. But in the earliest text associated with Daoism, the Tao Te Ching, we get passages like, deep and still, it appears to exist forever. I do not know whose son it is. It seems to have existed before the Lord. So they do have a word in Chinese for the Lord, what we would say Ishwara. But the Tao, the way, was pre-existent. So again, we have a non-theistic approach to things. In China and later in Japan, a system arose that in China is called Chan, and in Japan, Zen. And this has become a little popular now, even in India. Zen masters, with this sort of Taoist and free-form approach to spiritual things, developed modes of inquiry that were just the opposite. When you think, especially in say, Catholicism, when you want to become a good Catholic, they send you to catechism school, and you memorize sets of answers to questions. It's sort of a question and answer thing. What is God? God is this. What is the soul? The soul is that. And you need to know the right answer before you can be confirmed. In Zen, the approach is almost the opposite. So as the Japanese master Basui said, As you pursue this inquiry more deeply, your piercing doubt will penetrate to the depths, ripping through the bottom, and you will no longer question the fact that your mind is Buddha. A basic Zen idea is Buddha mind or Buddha nature, and it's within us all. So the idea was not to learn what is, the Buddha nature is this, and so forth, but you open your mind to the possibility of Buddha nature just by questioning. You must have heard of the Zen practice of meditating on a koan, a sort of meaningless phrase like, what was your face before you were born? That really has no answer. But just by plunging into that insoluble question, into just facing the doubt, then you get a breakthrough, a satori, as they say. So I was speaking earlier about the three Hellenistic philosophies of Greece and Rome. And again, they came in the cosmopolitan world that followed the conquest of Alexander. All three of these terms are sort of known in English now, and they're known. The meaning of the terms is always different from the meaning that they had in Greek itself. So Epicureanism, it's the system of Epicurus, has come to mean sort of a hedonistic approach to life, or taking pleasure in good food and good wine and that sort of thing. But while it's true that the Epicureans were interested in pleasure, as I'll show, the type of pleasure was not hedonistic, but actually something more like detachment. Stoicism to us means, well, just bearing things and shutting your eyes and going forward, stiff upper lip and that sort of thing. The Stoic system was much more than that. It did have to do with not reacting to outward impacts, but it wasn't, again, just a sort of push on and not think about it. Skepticism, to us now, it just means a sort of doubt and often a non-reflective doubt, that you just doubt everything because you don't believe that anything is worth believing in. Skepsis, which is the root of the word, simply means investigation. So skeptics were people who investigated, and as I'll show, their method was to counterbalance any statement by another statement, and then in so doing, bracketing them, they called you reach a point of equal-mindedness towards them, and then you achieve tranquility. All three of these paths, and you can really call them paths, spiritual paths, because unlike Aristotle and Plato and the earlier, more metaphysical philosophers of Greece, they had methods, they had ways that individuals could break free from the anxiety of ordinary life. Whoops. So again, Epicureanism, it evolved out of another philosophy that had a lot to do with seeking pleasure. But the kind of pleasure that they were seeking was freedom from disturbance. So one well-known Epicurean maxim was, ordinary food satisfies your hunger just as well as fancy dishes. So the idea is to be satisfied, and whether or not the food is the fanciest and the most expensive and spiciest and so forth, that doesn't matter. What you want to achieve is freedom from disturbance. That's the Greek word is ataraxia. The founder of the school was, again, Epicurus. He became best known in Europe. The system was rediscovered by the Roman philosopher Lucretius. And he was perhaps the most anti-religious philosopher in the whole ancient world. He's a famous line of his is, "To what a mass of ills could religion lead humanity?" So at a time when the Roman religion was a state religion, and that's something you really couldn't openly dispute, he rather courageously made statements like this, or here, speaking of the gods, then the poor creatures are plunged back into their old superstitions and saddle themselves with cruel masters, that is the gods, whom they believe to be all-powerful. For the Epicureans, there were gods, but they just were too far beyond us. They lived, they said, in the space between the worlds. And they took no interest in humanity whatsoever. So there was no point at all in praying to the gods or worshiping the gods. And yet, people, as he says here, deliberately clung to the gods and created miseries for themselves. In Stoicism, there were many practices. It also is a highly intricate philosophy that I won't go into here. They did believe in a God, but they identified God with the logos being the sort of universe as a whole that works for the betterment of humanity, as long as you don't interfere it. So you go with the flow which is a very modern thing, is something that a Stoic might well have said back in those days. So they had a practice that's now being revived, in fact, among modern Stoics, called the premeditatio malorum, or premeditation of evil. So the idea is that when you're faced with some conflict or some unpleasant thing that you think might arrive, you, instead of trying to chase it from your mind, you imagine the very worst that might happen has already happened. And the result is either you're destroyed or you'll be able to bear it. So there's no reason to worry about it. The Stoics were very concerned about what they were able to control and what was not able to be controlled. And if it's something that was something you couldn't control, you shouldn't sweat about it. And that way you achieved tranquility. They also, although they did accept this logos, they were against superstition. So here you have the famous Roman Stoic Seneca saying, "Superstition is an idiot heresy. It fears those it should love, the gods." Again, pointing out the idea that people shouldn't be, this is also a point made by the Epicureans, that we shouldn't fear the gods. If you fear the gods, you're just creating a lack of tranquility instead of actually going through it and into a state of ataraxia, of tranquility. For what difference does it make, Seneca continues, whether you deny the gods or bring them into disrepute? So again, a kind of heretical statement made by, and of course Seneca was a politician as well. So nevertheless was not afraid to in his letters that were published, make such a statement. Possibly the best known Stoic is Marcus Aurelius, because he also happened to be the 17th emperor of Rome. And it's kind of one of his opening aphorisms. He wrote a book that many of you might have read it's now called Meditations. It was just actually a diary of his that he kept. Like many emperors, he had to go around the empire and fight the Gauls here and fight other people on the other side of the empire. So one of his aphorisms begins something like, "What will happen to you today? You're going to meet people that are nasty, surly, unpleasant, and a total bore. How are you going to deal with this?" Well, if on the one hand, if you're the emperor, you could have just said, "Off with their heads," right? But he didn't take that. That was too easy. So he promoted this idea of tranquil acceptance of things. And again, we get into technical Stoic philosophy here, but they had a lot to say about impressions, first impressions, and that you should accept the impressions, they accept the way that things strike you, the way that the first impression, the way they feel right off, and don't add on to that. So, say you're a father and you find that your son is ill. The fact that my son is sick, that I can see, but that he may die of it, no. Stick with first impressions. Don't extrapolate, and nothing can happen to you. The last of these Hellenistic philosophies that I dealt. Incidentally, I chose to sort of feature these Hellenistic schools because perhaps you don't know them all that well, and you're, of course, familiar with Hinduism and perhaps also Jainism and Buddhism. So there was no point in a foreigner coming in and telling you about your own religions. So I thought it might be a little more interesting to deal with Greece and Rome. They're not inherently more interesting, but perhaps something new for you, so I thought it might be good to feature them. Skepticism, again, is a technical philosophy. It was developed by a philosopher called Pyrrho in Greece. Pyrrho is supposed to have come to India, at least supposed by some, to have had some contact with Indian thought. And there are people who point out similarities between some forms of Mahayana Buddhism and skepticism of this. There's different sorts of skepticism, but the skepticism of Pyrrho, they have many things. And one of the points of comparison is the way, the technique of the skeptics. So again, skepticism meaning investigation, not just simply doubt. That anytime you find a statement made, and when statements were made firmly, definitely, this is the truth, he called them dogmas, which in Greek means not theological opinion, theological utterance, but simply opinion. Dogma is something that you believe. So people generally have opinions about one thing or another. So say you put forward an opinion about one thing, it's always possible to bring up another opinion that has, in fact, equal weight to the first. So you set out oppositions among things which appear, not among things that are factual, right? You don't say the sun doesn't rise in the morning or things like that. But that there is a God or there isn't a God. These are opinions, finally. There's no way of proving them. So if some people say there is a God, someone else will be able to say that there isn't a God. And so the conclusion there is not that the life is meaningless, but that you sort of get, owing to the equivalence, the equal weight of the opposed objects and accounts, we come first to suspension of judgment, that they called epoche, a bracketing. It was a thing that was picked up later in the 20th century as a principle, but it goes back to the skeptics. So we come to a suspension of judgment. We don't say one way or the other, and afterwards to tranquility. So here were three ancient Western ways to achieve a tranquil life, and that we can't really speak of spirituality and project it back into Greece. It's just something where the whole frame of discourse, the things that people were discussing, the way that they were looking at things, to bring in a 21st century term like that doesn't really work. But certainly these were ways that have can be applied, let's say, to what we now call spirituality. So to conclude this presentation, and before we begin to discuss things, I try to move towards some sort of harmony, some sort of resolution here. I've been speaking about religious people and pointing out that there's a certain amount of dogmatism. And dogmatism, as we unfortunately know, fixed opinions and the sense of the necessity of forcing one's opinions on others often leads to violence. And so many of us are really concerned about the way that doctrinal religions are moving now. But at the same time, many religious people, perhaps most religious people, are deeply spiritual. And there are many many non-religious people are deeply spiritual. And religious people can see behind the exclusiveness of theistic religions. So it's not a really black and white situation that those who are theistic are in the wrong, those who are non-theistic are on the right path. What again, and I open this to discussion, what we need is a religion without fanaticism, a religion that's non-dogmatic, a religion that doesn't impose itself on others. And at the same time, we need a humanism that is free from the limitation of humanisms, the dryness, the lack of emotional engagement, and the sense of nothing really making sense. So with that, I'll open for discussion. I could continue. I have actually a whole speech here which I wrote and didn't read because it seemed better to engage with you a little more closely. So I hope now we'll get some questions and points to discuss.
Thank you for a truly engaging and inspiring treatment of these actually very vexed questions. Also for throwing into relief at least three different landscapes, if you will, of thought. One, which you've dwelt on, where there was a diversity of approaches to or away from the God idea in the axial age and in this cosmopolitan age of classical antiquity that you have outlined. But also, along the way, and certainly in your book, you dwell on the rise of the Enlightenment, the pressure it puts on the God idea, and how there are responses to it variously in the form of an outright atheism, but also the more pantheistic alternatives that some of the romantics explore. And then, of course, in the book, although not here, and I hope to draw you out in that, you also talk about the late 19th and early 20th century, where under the pressure of a certain kind of secular modernity, if you will, there's a way in which religious traditions recast themselves or are recast by active, even proselytizing agents, and some of them you identify, Vivekananda and Dharmapala among them, with the result that what some of us, at least in the global south or South Asia, take to be our religions are actually quite modern in the way in which they come across. But let me maybe begin by sort of approaching your conclusions. When you speak of a religion without fanaticism, this is I think a value that many of us, all of us in this room would share. But as you point out in your book and in a lot of your thinking, something fundamental to religion is the notion of revelations concerning the uniqueness of a certain kind of Godhead or divinity. So when you place two or three religions in adjacency, they will all have notions of God that cannot be reconciled. So while fanaticism is clearly undesirable, it's somehow written into the script of religions. So can I draw you out on this? I mean, I'm playing literally devil's advocate.
Well, it's certainly true that revealed religions, and even some non-revealed religions, have dogmatic certitudes. If they remain in communication just with their own followers, things don't go so badly. But it's rare that you can really seal off a religion from the world around it. Now, let's take the two most, at least historically speaking, the religions that have provoked violence and engaged in violence the most are are Christianity and Islam. And one primary reason for this is they're not only dogmatic, because most religions also are dogmatic, but they're missionary. And they feel it's their duty that they must impose their dogmas on everyone else. And when that happens, there's no way of avoiding violence or conflict, if not outright violence. But now we find that religions that are not revealed in the way that these Abrahamic religions are, make the same sort of dogmatic and exclusive and actually aggressive movements towards those around them. So we find even Buddhism now, surprisingly to many people, which people say, well, Buddhism is a religion of peace. I guess all religions say they're religions of peace, but now we find in Burma and in Sri Lanka that Buddhists can become just as violent and just as aggressive. Is there? You were saying it's inherent in religions. I'd like to believe that that's not the case. Historically, it appears that there's something to that. I mean, empirically, you just look and you see, well, there's religions, and practically all of them have had moments of violence towards others. Even Confucianism. I think Jainism maybe is the one large exception, and even then, Jain kings, when they were engaged in conquest, had to sort of forget about ahimsa for a while. So, is it necessarily a part of religion? This is a question more than a statement. Or is it a way that people approach their religions, whatever they might be, whatever kinds of dogma? And is there any hope for a world in which people could hold strong religious beliefs and yet not feel they had to impose them on others? There again, empirically, we haven't seen it yet. And it's a very regrettable thing, but it seems to be true.
Also, as you were speaking, something came to me that, of course, this is to one side of what you were focusing on, which was, in one sense, the kinds of, if you will, technologies of living that were developed by some of these Greek and Roman, the late Roman thinkers that you discussed. But where would something that I think preoccupies many of us who are fascinated by the possibility of belief, where would you place the question of evil in the world? I mean, that is something that religions do account for, particularly theistic forms of discourse would have a place for that.
Well, because they sort of have to. I mean, they get cornered by the fact that generally they assume a creative God that is all good, or at least is not outright evil, and yet they find in the world a lot of evil, and so they have to come up with some explanation, and usually they're pretty unconvincing, as far as I'm concerned. So, how is it possible? To me, the skeptical approach or the stoical approach that just, well, there is evil in the world. A stoic would say, bad things happen, right? And because bad things happen, well, there are certain bad things that happen that you have some control over, and so you can involve yourself in them to a certain limited extent. But a lot of bad things that happen that you have no control over at all. And it's really much better to, instead of saying, God has abandoned me, or what will I do, or it must be someone else's fault, just to say, that's the way it is. That's you've got to be able to accept that. As Marcus Aurelius said, your son is sick, or you've got cancer, or whatever else might happen. That's a fact. There's no getting away from it. But that, I'm going to be disturbed by it. That you can kind of filter out. You can just keep with the first impressions. Now, it may be that there is something that you can do about your cancer, or there is something that you can do about your son being sick. So you do what's necessary. You take him to a doctor. you get diagnosed, whatever sort of treatment is prescribed, then you go through it, but you don't get upset about it. And there's something rather Buddhist about that, no? Or the idea, say, even in Hinduism, that there's detachment as a main sort of thing, that you draw away, that you keep a sama mind and a sama what in Aurobindo calls the vital being, that you just don't get worked up by things. And it's probably the best thing to do for your son's illness or your own. So, and these are, well, Epicureanism, they did have a sort of set of things that people should learn. But skepticism and Stoicism, not so much. So these were not religions as we generally understood. They're approaches to life, philosophical approaches to life. And, right, they had a way of dealing with this that didn't cause all the anxiety that other people have when they feel that God has let them down.
I can't help feeling there's a kind of quietist, I don't want to say passive, but there seems to be a kind of quietist emphasis in these philosophies.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, quietism was a term that came much later, and also as it was considered by Christians to be the wrong way of going about things, because you're supposed to be actively engaged with God, praying to God, and that sort of thing. So when Madame Guyon, for instance, said that you just accept the will of God, that didn't go down well with the bishops. For one thing, because it made it unnecessary for there to be bishops. So the bishops had a complaint about that. Yeah, there is what you could call non-engagement. The question is, how much does engagement get you? I read an interesting article in Eon, that online magazine, by a Sri Lankan woman, very secular though, who was in England doing her studies, and it was when the mindfulness craze hit. And so she said, well, you're a Buddhist, you must know all about this. And she didn't know so much, but she engaged in the practices. She learned Vipassana and that sort of thing, and had a certain, I guess, Anglo vision on it that other, her British classmates didn't have. But then she pulled away, and she was a student of psychology, and she said, well, this is a cop-out. That you're not engaging with your problems, that here I am, and she openly admitted that, well, I realize I'm kind of neurotic. So, if you don't sit around thinking of your neurosis, then you're sort of cheating, right? You're not, you have a problem there and you're not dealing with the problem. And, yeah, there's a way, I mean, maybe people who are doing Vipassana meditation are not dealing with their children's screaming or whatever else. But do you really gain very much by, dwelling on your problems? I don't know. I mean, even in psychoanalysis and things like that, I guess, right, at certain things you're supposed to confront your, what comes to you in dream from your unconscious, and that's being, but frankly, I kind of think that very little, the idea that analysis really is never over, right? You keep on, that's analysis terminable and non-terminable, there's no end to it. And if this hang-up is over, then there's going to be another hang-up. So maybe being a little detached and not trying to solve problems that you can't really solve. That's I don't know if that's what you meant by quietism, but yeah. So in a word, yeah, maybe it is kind of quietistic, but what's the alternative?
Sort of counterintuitive. It's like, don't just do something, sit there. But I have a host of questions, but I'm going to open this up to questions from our colleagues. Is there a mic that can travel? Yeah.
Sorry. I just want to know, an atheist in a boat is about to capsize.
Right.
Who does he call? Would he say he has been wrong?
Probably he would, if especially.
Fear, right?
Pardon?
So finally, it's fear which God basically is the handle in the end.
Yeah. The cliche in that came, I think, in the First World War was that there are no atheists in foxholes. Foxholes being the pits that they used to in the front lines. I'm not so sure, actually. So some of the great war poets were atheists throughout. But, I mean, certainly fear is a great motivation for religious anxieties and reaching for a fixed religion, one or another, is a way to get away from that fear. Whether it's going to do much good while your boat is sinking, that's another question. It may be better just to, like the people singing on the Titanic as it went down, right? Just to accept it, right? Because there was no more boats. So, just live with it. But is that what you had in mind? Right. Certainly Freud thought that fear was the main motivation of religion. Absolutely, yeah.
Hello, Mr. Peter. You've talked about the history of spirituality and religion. And now, as we go ahead, more and more of our life is digital and very interlinked to technology. So, I would like to know your insight about the future of spirituality and religion, especially in the aspect of digital technology and how our life is getting so and so dependent on it. So, any insight on that?
Certainly, the forms are going to change very, very much and very, very quickly. But maybe this is kind of avoiding your question, but when you get down to the existential situation of man, whether he posts on Facebook or whether he's reading a text with illuminated writings or the Quran that they have upstairs, beautifully inscribed and all. The technology can change, but I think the situation is always the same. What forms it will take, that's the world of science fiction, and there's a lot of people who have played around with those ideas. I think the forms will be unrecognizable even in 50 years, not even 500. And we can sort of see, nowadays, social media and everything seems to be as much a lowering of the general consciousness as an occasional lifting of it. But like it or not, we're pretty soon going to be all interconnected all the time. Just when you walk out on the street, right, and every second person is staring at a phone, right, and engaging with something that is not in front of him. Hopefully it's not a car that's coming directly at him. But, have you thought about that? That everyone is really much more interested in something that's remote just simply because it's remote, right? Phones are very useful, right? You can call your wife or find out the best bus to take or that sort of thing. But that's not what people are doing. They're somehow reaching out into the wider cyberspace, if you wish, to use a silly word. And that's going to become much, much more. It's hard to see that not becoming the norm. That our interconnectedness will just overcome us. Maybe our individual consciousness will just sort of disappear along the way, because we have to. We'll be much more interested in likes, hits, that sort of thing. The idea that people who have religions, right? They'll say, well, we have 1 billion followers, as the Christians say, or Buddhists, I think it's 500 million, or that sort of thing. So that it gives you a sense of a belongingness. But when you put something online and you get 100,000 hits in the first minute, and stuff like that happens, right? It means that kind of we're weaving this sort of social identity that will color every single thing that we do. So religion surely will take on that kind of coloration. What it will become, it's I'm not a science fiction writer, but yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So to add to that question, I would like to ask, I've also heard about concepts of in the future, in the very future or maybe near future, our bodies and mind, our complete personality getting digitized, getting transformed into a digital file. So in that case, will spirituality exist, or is it somehow a property of our biology and somehow the property of the biology of our brain that makes us spiritual and religion?
I'm doubtful that we'll be able to download our personality when we die, and will exist in a hard drive somewhere and can just be rerun anytime. I think that I'm a believer in the biology of consciousness, right? I don't think that we can get away from that, really. And certainly our relationship to our individual consciousness as expressed through our bodies and minds is going to change greatly. But and I was going to say our souls will continue to exist. That sounds, which is something that I don't fully endorse, because even the idea of what constitutes a soul is really open to question. But if there will be any sort of personality, I think there'll be a problem of existence, right? I think you were talking about fear, Ashok, but I think just dealing with the what the Buddhists call dukkha, which often is translated suffering, but it comes down to just dissatisfaction, that things aren't always the way we want, right? I think human beings, if there still are human beings, they'll always be faced with that basic unsatisfactoriness of existence, and that's going to make religion or spirituality or something a necessity, I think.
Right. Thank you. That's all.
Mr. Mukherjee, do you have a question?
I'm asking you a very funny question. I was thinking all the time, the antiquity of religion. The antiquity of religion.
Right.
To my mind, less than 4,000 years old. And what happened to this planet before 4,000, when there was no religion, but humanity was there?
Right, well, we're talking about the sort of hunter-gatherer.
Before religion, humanity
Right.
before religion.
Right.
If we go back to prehistoric
Right.
life, there was no religion.
Well, there was some.
No, there is no evidence. No evidence, archaeological evidence.
Right.
Now, evidence in our context, if we consider the Hindu religion one of the ancient religions,
Right.
and we Hindus, we consider Vedas.
Right.
And the antiquity of Vedas, according to historian and archaeologist, 1000 BC.
Right.
Oral, entirely oral traditions.
Right.
And it all started with, fear. Initially, Rig Vedas, the thunder, flood, and then the concept of Indra develops.
Right.
All images, gods and goddesses, according to Hindu Shastras, from fear. But the question, I'm trying to ask you, how it developed, the religion, the concept of religion, it was not there. None of the prehistoric rock painting, we say rock painting,
Right.
but humanity existed. We have found many depiction where man trying to save the animal. Humanity is directly or indirectly linked to spirituality. So when there was no religion, humanity reflected in paintings, in rock-cut paintings, that goes back to 50,000 or 70,000 BC or BP. So some amount of spirituality, if we link to humanity, that existed before religion. And religion, according to archaeological evidences, according to history, it all started with the formation of society.
Yeah. That's was the point that I was going to make. And there's a lot of work being done now that either societies reached a certain, before complex societies, that's mainly agricultural societies, like in Mesopotamia and Egypt, there was no need of religions as we understand. So there I follow you absolutely. And the turning point they found, again, by going to documents and going to archaeological finds and so forth, when, or let's say there is a correlation between belief in what they call big gods, controlling gods, and complex societies such as agricultural societies. And before that, well, we don't really know, but certainly there was no big gods.
The three things, let me explain. While organizing, while doing the exhibition in the world, there was a section, imagining divine. There was a section. And what we learned while doing the research, it was very clear that man gave birth to God. It's not that God gave birth to man.
Sure, well, that's...
And that is something we forgot completely.
Yeah, right.
And all images, in all religions, from human imagination. From human imagination.
Right.
And
there I'm with you, but then how, you must have read that, say, people who are trying to interpret cave paintings and that sort of thing, whether in India or in Europe or anywhere, see them in terms not of organized religion, what we nowadays call magic, as being a sort of precursor of religion. Now that's something that can't be proved.
There are three stages we could see: that primitive religion,
Right.
from fear, the origin, and then there was a stage, philosophy based,
Right.
based on philosophy.
Yeah.
And then the third stage, when the concept of nation developed, authorities, kings and emperors, they
Right.
started using religion and misinterpreting religion for their own interest.
Right.
So we come across hundreds and thousands of public inscriptions where kings and emperors described, I am the son of so and so,
Right.
the god and goddesses.
Right.
So you have to listen to me.
Yeah.
So that was the stage, when religion, people started misinterpreting, misusing. So these are
Well,
the three stages.
miss means in relation to what? Because you yourself were saying that there was no such thing as religion before that. So if you misinterpret, there's an existing interpretation and you're distorting it. But weren't you saying just now that before these states arose that there was no religion?
I'm talking about, the primitive religion that was based on fear. So
Right.
people were afraid of, nature, their surroundings. So they
Okay.
imagined, various images of gods and goddesses.
Right.
And then the second stage, in our context,
Right.
say,
Well, in your exhibition,
second century to 6th century,
right,
philosophy based.
right, exactly. Okay.
And that continued even to some extent 18th century, 8th century.
Okay.
And then we see that, that misuse of religion, misinterpretation of religion in different continents. It's not only in India.
Right.
And that is being continued even today.
Okay.
Even politicians, they are using religion, for their, this thing.
Okay. In your exhibition, what did you put as an example of the religion of fear, the religion before large gods? What I mean, I didn't see.
No,
the exhibition.
we'll give you the catalog. For the first time, we could bring about 20-25 different images of gods and goddesses from different countries.
Right.
So,
Okay.
So in India, yes, some gods, out of fear, even in Africa. So there were at least 4 or 5 3 or 4 images from Africa and other countries
I see.
out of fear. So
Okay.
those images, those gods and goddesses represent primitive religion.
Okay. And were the African examples ancient, or were they in modern tradition?
No, that now there are many sects, they are continuing,
okay.
Ancient primitive religion. Even in India, there are many sects, they
Sure,
do follow
sure.
primitive religion. Tantra in Bengal,
Right, sure.
8th, 9th century. Somewhere it has connection with the primitive religion, religious practices.
Okay.
Even tribal religion, when we study tribal religion based on primitive religion.
Okay. And
So
so
all
you
sacrifice.
see that as even now, say the Gauns or something like that, as representing a form of religion that preceded the state religion? Among the tribals, what in India we call the tribals.
The tribals, that is what I am saying.
Yeah.
That they still practice that primitive religion.
Right.
But they also started, adding many things.
Sure, now they've been
As world is
Hinduized to a
changing,
great extent.
religiosity, philosophy, everything is changing.
Yeah.
Raja, there's someone behind you first. Could we? Okay. Yeah, because then we'll just gather the questions. Yet,
There are 5 words that I came across when I was reading someone called Ken Wilber.
Yeah.
He uses the word animistic to begin with, and then he uses the word called mythical, then he uses the word called religious, then he uses the word called rational, and the 5th word that he uses is spiritual. There seems to be a progression in his way of...
What was the first?
animistic was the first. Animistic, mythic.
What does animistic mean? Animistic, okay.
Okay, could you pass the mic to question after that?
If you answer all, I'll just say my question. Should I say my question right away?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, when we are talking about us, I believe we are made in 3 parts. We are emotions, we are intelligence, and we are consciousness.
Okay.
So, and we are saying that fear motivates religion. So, we are relating an emotion to religion. So, what do we correlate spirituality with, and what do we correlate atheism with, and what do we correlate theism with the respective emotions, intellect, and consciousness?
Well, I think if you had to make a correlation, and if you see spirituality is different from religion, I think you'd want to correlate it with consciousness. Because let's say there's a kind of religion, as Dr. Mukherjee was saying, that is rationalistic. So that's what you want to correlate with a certain type of intellectual religion. So that gives something for your mind to work. I think you can't make really fixed correlations because there's a lot of overlap between these sorts of things.
All interlinked.
Yeah. So, I mean, for instance, I'd like to say that consciousness freed from overpowering emotion and freed from a kind of intellectualization would be associated with spirituality. But, I mean, spirituality also does and should have an emotional warmth. It should have a rationality about it. So I'm not so sure that you can slot these things into one sort of thing and another all that cleanly.
And atheism?
Depends what kind of atheism you're talking about. I mean, atheism historically was sort of a rationalistic reaction against overly doctrinal and overly fear-based religions. But there's different types of atheism. So there's a non-theism, as I was saying, rather than atheism, that can be associated with spirituality. Yeah, I think your categories are sort of useful for thinking about things in one way or another, but I wouldn't want to get locked into them in a fixed kind of form that way.
Because that's something I was thinking about while this very interesting discussion was going on, that the emphasis of these accounts tended to be on a reactive kind of mode, out of fear, but there's also everything that the religious imagination or spiritual practice achieves by way of wonderment or speculative delight or ecstatic pleasure and all of that. So that's just a thought. It just came up out of all this. And there was a glimmer of that with the Vedic verse from the 10th mandala that you had. The inquiry into the nature of the universe. That is a very, very different kind of approach to these questions of what is larger than us. And it kind of opens the door to what much, much later and elsewhere becomes a kind of engagement with the transcendental. So I don't know if, by way of conclusion, you want to dwell on these aspects of not only how one leads one's life in an ethical manner premised on tranquility, but also how one might reach out of oneself through compassion or ecstasy or some larger sense of oneself.
That I stress the individual nature of spirituality, the autonomy, but to say there also, as I was just telling the gentleman, you don't want to get too caught up in your categories. Categories are useful for thinking about things, but spirituality is very broad. Religion is very broad, and so reaching out for the transcendent, I think it tends to be associated with a certain type of religion, that top-down religion, if you will, with a creator God. But I mean, there's a transcendence in ordinary life that you don't maybe, and someone who believes in that kind of transcendental religion still has to deal with it in his ordinary life. And someone who rejects transcendental religion has to deal with the uncanny, the unexplainable in everyday existence. So we use these categories to kind of try to think things through, try not to get caught in a fixed position. But then we have to let them go too, and not get caught in our what we thought was freeing us, because that in itself becomes a kind of chain after a while.
That'll be the last question.
Yes, definitely.
Aparna, you have one. Okay, then I would have to ask Aparna to go first since you had your chance. We'll come back to you in a bit.
This guy in
Hello, Dr. Hay. Thanks for the interesting lecture.
You're very welcome.
Actually, I just wanted to share. Somebody forwarded one clip on sale, and it has got two dinosaurs, mother and child. And the child asks mother, "Mother, is there God?" And she answers, "Not yet." So it is true that man gave birth to God. And my query is, would you like to throw some light on Marxist approach to religion and spirituality? Though it is little bit later.
Well, I'm not an expert on Marxist philosophy. Of course, the famous, now it's almost a cliche, is religion is the opiate of the masses. That's often misunderstood. The idea is not that it is something that stupefies people, but it's something that makes life bearable for people who are caught up in what Marx saw as an unequal, unjust social system. So that this, and of course he was thinking about the early industrial revolution in Germany and England, where the life of the workers was really horrible, and that's how religion got worked in there. So it's the cry of the oppressed heart, something like that. No, it was kind of and maybe, you know, the class who owned the means of production encouraged religion, and I think it can be said that the late Victorian church and state both encouraged religion to, you know, keep people happy enough that they'll keep those machines working. So that's another approach of where religion comes from, and certainly we can't get away from the social aspect of religion. And what Marx, of course, when he deconstructed religion in that way, it was left with nothing but a bunch of empty beliefs, and God was maybe the largest and worst of those empty beliefs. I'm sure someone who knows about Marxism more than I would be able to criticize that. But
Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the soul of soulless conditions. Religion is the opiate of the masses. And I seem to have given myself the last word, but such is life. I want to thank you, Peter, for so generously sharing your research and your work of many, many decades, and addressing questions that are not only of academic relevance to us, but that are so deeply existential. And thank you all for being such a marvelously engaged audience.
thank you very much. Thank you for coming.